Let me start. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Imtiaz Yusuf, a lecturer at the Istac-Iium here in Malaysia. Istac means International Institute for Islamic Thought and Civilization, which is attached to the International Islamic University, Malaysia. I welcome you all to the 9th Istac-Iium lecture series on futures of integration of human knowledge and civilizational development. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. I read it, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. This is the first verse of the Quran, which is translated so by Muhammad Marmaduke Victor. And it is so precise that I like it. It doesn't have the adjectives, most gracious, most merciful, which shows you about how English language works or translation works. And Victor was a famous British Muslim convert. I was just reading he converted in 1917, November. That means after the October Revolution, Bolshevik or Communist Revolution in the USSR. And his translation of the Quran is known as the Meaning of Glorious Quran. And it is one of the most widely read translations. Tonight's title is Islam in Victorian Britain, with a focus on the life of Fatima Elizabeth Cates, 1865-1900. So we have entered in the age of discovering Islam in the United Kingdom, though there has been a lot of relations between the United Kingdom and the rest of the Muslim world. Our speaker today afternoon in the UK and here in the night is Dr. Yahya Birt. He is the research director of the Ayaan Institute, London, UK, and I have been following him or his works for many decades. Let me give a brief CV of Dr. Yahya. Dr. Yahya Birt is a community historian who has taught at the University of Leeds, has published over a dozen peer-reviewed articles on Islam in Britain, and co-edited British Secularism and Religion in 2016, followed by Islam in Victorian Liverpool, 2021, the collected poems of Abdullah Quillam, 2021, and more recently, he co-wrote the book Our Fatima of Liverpool, 2023. And he's also the founding series editor for the Oxford British Muslim Studies series published by the Oxford University Press. In 2022, Dr. Yahya published his first poetry collection, Pandemic Pilgrimage, reflecting on performing Umrah under COVID. He is the research director at the London-based think tank, the Ayaan Institute, where he works on Muslim minorities. His first report was released in 2022 called Ummah at the Margins, the Past, Present, and the Future of Muslim Minorities, a topic which interests most of us who are living as Muslim minorities, not in Malaysia, but around the world. He lives in West Yorkshire with his family and cat. He likes walking and being grumpy. I hope it is not going to be that tonight about the state of the world. So Yahya, take it over.
Thank you very much, Professor Imtiaz, for that very fulsome introduction. And thank you for inviting me as part of this prestigious lecture series. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we will have tonight. So briefly, I will share my screen, which is a presentation, which will give an overview of Islam in Britain, assuming people have no familiarity, and then we will move to. Then I'll focus in on the life of Fatima Cates, who's been the subject of my most recent book. So let me share my screen. Oops, sorry. So how do I get to the big screen?
You need to go to that icon, slide icon. At the bottom, on your right. This the first one. No. Oh, it doesn't show here. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, we can see it now. Who muted you? You need to unmute yourself. Okay.
Okay, yeah, so I'm
Yeah.
going to start off with a bit of an overview and then focus in on Fatima's life. You know, we today we live in a world of 234 nation states and territories, but it's worthwhile reminding ourselves that 120 years ago, we lived in an imperial age, and there were several imperia at this time. But our story is really focused on two. The British Empire, obviously, which straddled the globe at this moment in time in 1900. And there are about 100 million Muslims living within the British domains. And but the, if you like, the crown jewels of the British Empire was India. And probably the largest body of Muslims under British control were within British India. On the picture on the right, you can see the Ottoman domains at the time, obviously reduced from their height in the 16th century, particularly in Europe. Territory had been ceded over time. But still, the Ottoman Empire in 1900 still controlled considerable territories in South Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, and North Africa. And at this time, the Caliph, the Sultan Caliph was Abdul Hamid II, and he ruled over 20 million Muslims within his domains. So remarkably, something like 5 times the number of Muslims lived under British control as compared to the Ottomans. But as we shall see, for the very small British Muslim community that was beginning to emerge in Britain, the colonial metropole, around 1900, they still looked to Sultan Abdul Hamid as the leading unifying Muslim political figure at the time. And as we shall see, they had active relationships with the court in Yildiz Palace in Istanbul. But first I'm going to, so there are about 10,000 Muslims altogether in Britain, under 10,000 at this time. And I'm going to give an overview of what kinds of people were coming backwards and forwards at this time. It was mostly, for the most part, working people, ordinary people who were sojourners. So that would mean people who would come, stay for some time, live and work, and then return. So these weren't necessarily all permanent settlers, but they were more sojourners. So the first type to think about were servants and ayahs. Ayahs was the Urdu term used for nannies. And these domestic servants were attached to British colonial families seeking status. And no family of any kind of status in India would be taken seriously without having domestic servants. And as they'd grown habituated to this, when they returned to England in retirement, quite often they brought their domestic servants and nannies back with them. And these could be very variable relationships, could either be relationships of great affection and intimacy, that the nanny was seen as a member of the family de facto, but alternatively, they could be very abusive relationships. And so unfortunately, some of these Muslim women who worked as nannies could be thrown out of their homes of employment, thrown out onto the streets of London, and suffered poverty and joblessness. As a result, some Christian philanthropists set up the Ayah's Home in Hackney in around about 1900, and to save them from squalid lodgings, and to give them some kind of refuge. In fact, we have a system in the UK called the Blue Plaque system, which is where a significant person or building is honoured with a blue plaque. So last year, after a campaign by a local activist, Muslim activist, the Ayers home was given a plaque in Hackney, which is in East London. Another category of person were the Lascars. Now, this is a kind of English bowdlerization of al-askari. It's a military term in Arabic, but in English, it came to be used in a different sense to refer to non-European sailors employed in the British merchant fleet. And it really meant that part of British trade which went out through the Suez Canal and was powered by the revolution in steam. So steamships could go much faster, more frequently, and unlike ships under sail, were not bound by prevailing winds. So there was a huge expansion in trade with these two things. And so many of the British merchant ships would go out through the Suez Canal out east, and they would lose sailors. Some would abscond, others would fall ill and die, and they would want to replace men on the decks. And so they hired men locally. And so these are often Muslims, but not entirely Muslims. They would be picked up from Bengal, Gujarat, Yemen, Somaliland, Egypt, and would come back to England regularly as part of the crew. And often they would be left, again, jobless in the docks in London or Liverpool. And they would be looking for work to take them back out on the routes back out east. Again, often suffered great poverty and homelessness. Again, there was a stranger's home, which now no longer exists, unfortunately. The building's been knocked down, which was in the West India docks, but again, set up for the same purpose as the Ayers home. And this was a, extraordinarily large phenomenon. So, over 15% of all sailors in the British merchant fleets were Lascars. So we're talking about something like over 50,000 men around just before the start of the First World War coming in and out of the docks in Britain on a regular basis. And this is why in the history of Islam in Britain, we find that some of the earliest communities, settled communities, began with the nucleus being Lascars, sailors, Muslim sailors who decided to stay. Even some of the Lascars actually ventured inland away from the ports at a later stage. So I'll give you one example. For instance, recent research in Bradford has shown that the core of people who set up the first mosque in Howard Street in 1958 were Pashtun Lascars or sailors. It had thought that they were predominantly men with military connections, but in fact, in this case, it was sailors. So we've had nannies, servants, we've had sailors. Now we talk about the army. And the British Empire recruited a huge army, the British Indian Army, of 1.5 million. It was said to be a volunteer army, but many families report from their family histories that in fact there was quite often cases of a sort of forcible conscription in villages. So, it's something that needs a bit more unpacking. But after the uprising of 1857, the British ensured that no one religion or ethnicity dominated the British Indian Army. And so there was a deliberate policy that a third of this army would be kept as Muslim, and it wouldn't become a higher figure. Still, that meant 400,000 Muslim men fought in the First World War. They were deployed in all of the hottest spots of that war, like Ypres, the Somme, and Passchendaele. Obviously, they would be injured, and the Brighton Pavilion, which was a kind of Mughal pastiche built for the British royal family in Brighton, it was converted into a hospital during the First World War, and these men were were sent there to recuperate. The Muslims were offered a Muslim burial at the first purpose-built mosque in Woking. And here we see on the left a picture of the men praying in uniform, praying the Eid al-Fitr in 1916 during the war. So we've talked about working class Muslims, but there was also an elite class too that came to Britain. I could give you many examples who were here in Britain between 1880 and 1920, but I'll just pick out three. I'm sure the eagle-eyed among you will have probably recognized a couple of them already, but we have Allama Iqbal, the philosopher poet. He studied 2 degrees in England. 1906, he did a kind of arts degree at Cambridge, and in 1908 he got a law degree at Lincoln's Inn. In between, he got his doctorate in Germany. In the center is a young Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, who again studied law in Lincoln's Inn, graduating in 1895. And then finally on the right, we have a very important but neglected figure, an early figure in Pan-African Times and Orient Review. I hope everybody can hear me. It says my internet connection is unstable. Is everything okay?
Can you repeat the name of the African person here?
Yeah, so he was the Sudanese Egyptian intellectual Dus Muhammad Ali, who was actually educated in England. He sets up Britain's first Black political journal. He was an anti-imperialist, and he brought together anti-imperialist trends throughout Asia and Africa. It's a very important figure, and I hope to do more work on him in the future. But he was very active in the Islamic scene, such as it was in London at the time. So we can see we had these, elite Muslims who were coming to England for education, law, medicine, and so on, but they were often very politically active as well and got involved in philanthropy. The Red Crescent was established and set up from London with Sayyid Amir Ali in 1911, 1912. And there were a number of other projects and campaigns that were being run at the time. So 1880 to 1920 marks the years in which we have the first organized religious life emerging in Britain. Obviously, as Professor Imtiaz said at the beginning, there were contact between the Muslim world and Britain was extensive and went back centuries through trade and diplomacy and so on. But here we're talking about and Muslims visited regularly and so on, but here we're talking about the emergence of organized religious life. And here are the first 3 mosques that were set up in England in this period. I'm going to spend more time talking about the one on the left, the interior photograph of the Liverpool Muslim Institute. We'll come back to that. The one on the right, the colored photograph, is of a private purpose-built mosque that was established for the Oriental College. It was commissioned and built by William Gottfried Leitner, a Hungarian Orientalist. But it was meant only for the private use of his students, and he kind of restricted its activities. So it didn't really open as a public place of prayer until much later, after the college had closed. So it opened as a functioning mosque in 1912, despite having been completed in 1889. In the center is the London Temporary Mosque, which operated from 2 different locations between 1895 and 1900. It was set up by a South African Muslim who had moved to England, Haji Muhammad Doli, and it was affiliated with the Liverpool Mosque. So let's carry on. So we'll say a little, by point of kind of contrast, I'll say a little bit about the Woking Mosque. So as I said, it was kind of set up as a working mosque from 1913, sorry, not 1912. And it was called the Woking Muslim Mission. It was set up by a lawyer from Lahore, Khwaja Kamaluddin. He stood on the right of this picture here. On the left is his most famous convert, Lord Al-Farouk Headley, who converts at quite an advanced age in 1913. And in a way, he was, in a way, many ways, he was sort of greatest capture, kind of a peer and an aristocrat, an Anglo-Irish peer who sat in the House of Lords. This was a it was very much a missionary institution. It targeted middle class converts to Islam, English converts. And it ran a journal called the Islamic Review, which continued right up until 1967. It tended to be politically establishment. It tended to be to try to avoid controversy, although that wasn't always the case, and particularly when the caliphate was threatened after the First World War. Let's move on now to the first mosque community in England, the early Liverpool Muslims. So unlike Woking, the Liverpool convert movement was working class and mostly local people. And over the course of 20 years, between 1887 and 1908, to about 243 people converted to Islam. But this was not a kind of community that was isolated and living on its own. Because it was in a great port, Liverpool, where many people came in and out from the east, from Suez, ships would come through the Suez Canal up to Liverpool. They interacted with Indian Muslims, the Manchester Arab cotton traders who had started their exporting cotton, finished goods to the Middle East and to Morocco from the early 19th century onwards. On the left here, we can see a picture actually with the leader of this Liverpool community, Abdullah-Quilliam, sat in the center with Muhammad Mustafa Karsa, who was the Ottoman trade consul for Manchester. And around him are some Ottoman citizens, Arab Muslims who associated themselves with the Liverpool Mosque, which over time became connected to two courts, the Ottoman court and the Afghan courts. The third important group, and shouldn't be overlooked, are the West Africans. They had extensive connections with the West Africans, and the leader of the community, Abdullah-Quilliam, did a tour in 1895 of 6 West African countries. It was greeted as a representative of the Caliph, and they had long-standing interests in countering Christian mission in West Africa and in promoting education there. So, as I mentioned, the leader of this community was Abdullah-Quilliam, who dies in 1932. He was a Liverpool lawyer and journalist. He had a double training and a double career. He came from a non-conformist background. So for those who don't understand what that means, in Britain, in England, we have one established official Protestant church. That's called the Anglican Church. It's been established since the 16th century. Any Protestant church other than the Anglican Church is called non-conformist, and it's not established. So these are the smaller Protestant churches. In the 19th century, 20th centuries, these smaller churches, even before that actually, these smaller churches were often associated with political reform. They tended to be politically progressive and quite dynamic. And so nonconformism was very much associated with another movement that Quilliam himself grew up in. Both sides of his family had been involved in this movement, including both sets of his grandparents. And this was the temperance movement. The temperance movement was a 19th century campaign begun in America, spread to Britain, and gradually became globalized, which looked to reduce and ultimately prohibit the sale of alcohol. And they looked to get people in the big new industrial cities of the West to give up alcohol because they saw it as a source of many social ills. So Quilliam, as a child, took the pledge never to drink alcohol at the age of 7. So he never drank alcohol his whole life. And so after a visit to Morocco and a period of self-study thereafter, he embraces Islam privately in 1886. But what marks him out as an historic figure as far as British Muslims are concerned today is that he begins really the first public call to Islam in 1887. And we're going to hear more about that now. So the rest of the lecture is going to be looking at Fatima Elizabeth Cates, who lived between 1865 and 1900. We don't have any photographs of her. So in this section of the slide, you'll see some artist's impressions to give some kind of visual content to this part of the lecture, interspersed with some real historical photographs, which I shall point out. So in June of 1887, Quilliam begins his call to Islam, and the second lecture he ever gives is in Birkenhead, which is a town to the west of Liverpool on the other side of the Mersey River. And the talk is called The Great Arabian Teetotaler. And he gave it to the Birkenhead Working Men's Temperance Association, so obviously part of the temperance movement. What was extraordinary about Frances Elizabeth Murray, as she was then known, Frances, at the age of 22, was already the secretary of this association, and she came to hear Quilliam speak on this great Arabian teetotaler. And we have Fatima's conversion account, and she had many misconceptions about Islam and about the Prophet, and asked many questions of Quilliam afterwards, asking, did women have souls, and was it not an intolerant religion, and so on. And these were the sorts of ideas that were common currency then in Victorian England. But Quilliam put her mind at rest and said, look, I'm not going to try and persuade you tonight. I'm going to lend you my copy of the Quran, and you find out for yourself, read it for yourself. So this was a translation of the Quran by the British lawyer and a vicar, a priest, George Sale, which came out in 1734. So Quilliam had given her a reprint of that to read. Frances herself, comes from a really ordinary working class background. Her father was a porter in a local market in Birkenhead, and she was in the first cohort in Britain to get some kind of statutory education, which at that time went between 5 and 12. So she had some education, but she was obviously bright and driven and principled to be engaged in social activism by her 20s. She came from a large family of 6, and we'll hear more about some of her family later on. They were obviously a family came with kind of a devout, nonconformist background as well, like Quilliam. So Fatima goes home. She has a copy of the Quran that Quilliam has given her. Her mother, a devout Christian, discovers that she's reading the Quran, and asks her what she's reading, and she says, I'm reading the Muhammadan Bible. And she says, how dare you bring that into our house? Give it to me, I will destroy it. And Frances refuses, runs into her room, locks the door, and continues to study. And her family tried to stop her attending meetings with the other handful of converts. So Fatima was still Francis at this point. Francis was the third to convert and the first woman. The others were Quilliam himself and another man called Ali Hamilton. So these three were meeting once a week to discuss the Quran and other teachings, basic teachings of Islam. They were largely self-taught, and Francis must have found these arguments convincing, because within about 2 weeks of meeting Quilliam, she becomes Fatima, and they admit themselves to Islam. They have no born Muslim to admit them to Islam. They admit themselves to Islam. They sign their names under a threefold pledge to believe in Allah, to believe in Muhammad, and to believe in the Quran and what it says is true. So this kind of threefold pledge that they sign, and they have to teach. They teach themselves from what they know, we're getting on to this now. So what happens is that Quilliam has come out of the temperance movement. So has Fatima, so has Ali Hamilton. So they use a temperance hall in Liverpool. They hire a room there. And I think their initial plan is to call other members of the temperance movement to Islam on the basis that Islam is the greatest teetotalist movement in history, shall we say. And so they begin their call. And over a period of about 2 years, the number of 3 grows to 14. But it's not without difficulty and without opposition. So Fatima and the others face abuse and violence. People come in on occasion and try to break up their meetings. Stones, mud are thrown at them. Fatima is pinned down. Horse manure is rubbed on her face. But despite the opposition at home and the opposition on the street, Fatima is a dauntless, brave woman, and she never misses a meeting. Nothing deters her. She's utterly committed to this new path. So after 2 years, the landlord kicks them out of the temperance hall. This small band of 14 converts moves to larger premises, a handsome terraced house at 8 Brome Terrace on a very busy road, the West Derby Road that leads into the city centre, and there's a lot of foot traffic and carriage traffic going down the street. What changes here is that they begin the call to prayer, and for the first time in England. And so before they have their prayer meeting, which is held once a week on a Sunday, to have their prayer meeting, they call the adhan in Arabic and then in English from an open front window overlooking the main road. And this is how they call people to come to their meetings. And as you can imagine, it gets a very polarized reaction. They get some curious people coming in to find out what's going on. But again, they still receive more of this hostile attention. So all the windows in the front of the little house mosque are regularly broken. But they continue on regardless. Even sometimes the muadhin is injured for making the call to prayer. But they continue, and over time, converts keep joining the community every year. Now here we see, this is the only photograph that we have of the interior of the mosque as it was. This is an historical photograph. And it shows very clearly, actually, that this part of the mosque actually is the part facing away from the Qibla. So if you can imagine, if you turn the camera 180 degrees, you would see the mihrab, and you would see those prayer rugs out for the salah, or the namaz, as they called it in this community, being influenced by the Ottomans mostly and the Indians. But if this shot here is not of that part of the mosque. This is of the other part, the stage. Okay, so on this stage you can see that they held another kind of event in the mosque, and from the earliest part, starting from 1887 and continuing in Brome Terrace, these were the Sunday divine services held at 7 o'clock. So after the call to prayer, they would call people in, they would sit in chairs in front of this stage, And then the imam would come out from behind those curtains, you can see in the background, wearing robes. And for all intents and purposes, this looked and felt like a Protestant evensong, an evening service, but with Islamic content. So they sung hymns with Islamic wording, but to tunes that were popular at the time, played accompanied by an organ, which you can see on the right-hand side here of this picture. And they would read out passages from George Sale's translation of the Quran. And the Imam would give a speech, often quite virulently anti-Christian, and would quite often disgruntle some members of the people who'd walked in off the street, and people would get up if they were finding it too difficult to listen to. And so we had this kind of it looked like an act of worship. And both Christians and Muslims who wrote about this community at this time said so. And it was controversial for the Orthodox Muslims who came. And Istac-Iium and his community got a lot of criticism for it. And the interesting thing is that this was a convert community on a journey, you can imagine. So from admitting themselves to Islam and teaching themselves, let's say nearly 20 years later, the same institute issues a prayer manual, which is basically Hanafi fiqh. This is in 1906. You can see a kind of a community on a journey, but these kinds of divine services, as they called, and originally the mosque was actually called the Church of Islam. This is in the first 3-4 years. Later on, it's referred to exclusively as a mosque. And these Sunday divine services are called repositioned as dawah. Okay, and that's how they're called later on, around about 1896. They begin to be called something different. But I think, we have to be alive to the fact that this was a community in transition over time. So Fatima was the second most important figure in this community. She was a co-founder of this community along with Istac-Iium. And why do I say that she was the second most important? Because she represented the community. So when they met people like the Ottoman trade consul to Liverpool, or they met foreign dignitaries coming from abroad, they report that they were often met by Istac-Iium and Fatima representing the women of the community. The other reason why Fatima was important, two other reasons. One was that she brought other women to Islam. We'll talk about some of them later, but she was a very active da'iya. And also she was the treasurer, the first treasurer of England's first mosque community for 8 years, up until 1894. So I thought I'd focus a little bit on the Muslim converts of the community. Here's a the only picture we have actually of some of them. The women did not cover in this community, although they would wear a kind of a traditional Victorian hat when they were sat in service. And a quarter of the converts were women, and they tended to be more middle-aged. Fatima was exceptional in being young, converting at the age of 22. They tended to be independently minded, curious women. They often argued and saw Islam as a vehicle for the reform of women's rights. Fatima herself and another convert who came from America, Nafisa Keep, who came for 6 months. So they argued that actually, because in Islam, nikah is not a sacrament, but it's a contract, this is in fact more allowed more equality for women than the prevailing divorce law in England at the time. And the women, some of them married, the women converts, some of them married foreign Muslims and moved abroad, like Halima Murray, who is Fatima's younger sister. She marries Sayyid Abdul Halim Mahmood, who an Indian lawyer who goes back to live in Calcutta, and she goes out and moves with him there. Or Helen Karsa, who marries the Ottoman trade consul for Manchester. Or Amy Makaish, who marries a Beirut trader, Ali Makaish. And then some of the other converts like Zuleika Banks and Amina Bowman, they marry fellow converts. And yeah, I get asked this question every time I give this talk, but it seems like even amongst the converts who married, the women who married, the ones who moved abroad and married into born Muslim families, their children tended to remain in the faith, whereas convert couples, their children, as far as I can tell, didn't seem to remain in the faith for the most part. So as I said, this convert community was not an isolated community, and in its after those first 2 years in the Temperance Hall, when they moved to Brome Terrace, really the most important community to help them was the largest body of Muslims in the British Empire, who were the Indian Muslims. And we don't exactly know how word got to them, but it seems that word got to them around about 1889, when they were still a small community in a temperance hall of 14. Somehow, probably through Muslim student networks, or maybe Indian sailor networks coming out of Liverpool, somehow word got back. And the kind of what were called the Anjumans, the Islamic association set up by that class of upwardly mobile Indian Muslims who had been part of the Aligarh educational movement, who wanted to study law and medicine in England. They were the ones who got in contact with this community of converts in Liverpool. And the key figure here is Rafiuddin Ahmed, who came to England in 1889 to study law, and he becomes vice president of the Liverpool Muslim Institute, and he plays a very important role in introducing the Liverpool converts to the Indian Muslims and getting their support. Rafiuddin plays a big role in promoting Fatima as one of the faces of that community, and so she writes her conversion story in the Allahabad Review, which was published in 1891. She's asked to provide the bona fides of the organization. She's listed as a treasurer. They publish their articles, their constitution, their rules of association, the list of their members in India, and this is to provide their bona fides to show that that it's an authentic community. As I may have said before, 2 of Fatima's sisters convert to Islam and marry Indian law students, and so Fatima's connections with the Indian Muslims is also personal and not just through promoting the institute. But very movingly, and I think this is very significant, that Fatima only wrote 2 poems that survive until today. And one poem she wrote, very interestingly, she wrote it in praise of Shah Jahan, who was the 3rd Begum of Bhopal, which was a major Muslim Indian princely state in British India. And she reigned, for the last sort of 30 years or so of the 19th century. And the reason why she's significant for British Muslims is that she contributes £10,000, 2/3 of the cost, for building Leitner's purpose-built mosque in Woking, the first to be built in England. And Fatima writes a poem praising her, and she compares it to Khadija. And I find this very moving because, why is she calling Shah Jahan the Khadija for Muslims in Britain? Because she's saying that when nobody else supported British Muslims, you came, you believed in us, and you supported us with your wealth. And is this not the role of Khadija, the beloved first wife of our Prophet? So this is a very, in a way, if you like, if Shah Jahan is the Khadija, is Fatima, is she like Fatima, or maybe she's like an Aisha? I don't know, of our first British Muslim pioneers. So Fatima had more tests, not just opposition from local society, but unfortunately also within her marriage. Her husband, Hubert Henry Cates, she marries him in 1889. The next year, he converts to Islam himself, having been persuaded by her and having, earlier opposed her conversion. but she's strong-willed and a great example, and he converts to Islam. Unfortunately, he proves to be, it doesn't seem to reform his character. And so it's very quickly the marriage descends into abuse and violence, at times even murderous violence. The second time, really, Fatima only escapes with her life because her sister Clara Halima, who had also converted by that time, saves her really from her husband. They run to the police, they ask for a divorce, but it's only granted a judicial separation. But after that, there's no return really, although they're never formally divorced. As far as we're aware, they never lived together again after 1891. So after her trials and so on and traumas that she suffered, it seems like she got some relief. And so for several months, she travels out to the east with two other English Muslim converts, Zuleika Banks and Amina Makaish. We don't know exactly where they went, but because Amina Makaish was married to Ali Makaish, who had family in Beirut, we think probably they went to Beirut and stayed there, and probably possibly went on to do some sightseeing in Damascus. This is what this picture here is, imagining Fatima visiting the Grand Mosque, Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. Fatima spent more time away also for photographing landscapes in the south of England in 1895. So as we can see, you know, her, after being at the heart of this community, having gone through all this test and trauma, maybe she pulls back a little bit from a newspaper, announces that Fatima has died at the young age of 35 after having been ill for 2 years. Sorry, I hope you could hear me there.
We missed a part of you. We missed a part.
Okay, so the community newspaper, the Crescent, announces that Fatima has died young. Is in October 1900 after being ill for 2 years and having lived alone with her son after her husband's death in 1896. So in this narrative, in the official newspaper, the official account is portrayed as a kind of a lonely woman who lives far away from the institute. She lives in a little town 20 miles away from Liverpool called West Kirby. She lives with her son, who is born to her former abusive husband. And so this is a kind of the narrative that is shown, the official narrative. But in fact, the work that I've done with myself and my colleague Hamid Mahmoud, who wrote this, we found actually this is not the true story. Actually, our research leads us to believe that Fatima was Quilliam's secret third wife. And the simple reason why we got onto this trail is because when we went back and looked at archival records, we found that actually Fatima's son was born 17 months after her former husband died. So the father must have been somebody else. We started looking at all the evidence, and the circumstantial evidence points strongly to Quilliam as the father. He advocated and practiced polygamy, and at the time he was maintaining 2 other families with Hannah and Mary, his other wives. We can see here one piece of the evidence that we bring, which is the kind of remarkable physical similarity between Abdullah Quilliam on the right in his 30s, and then on the left, Hubert Halim, we believe his son, in his early 20s. You can see a similarity there. The community ends in 1908. Quilliam is struck off for falsifying evidence in a divorce case, struck off from practicing as a solicitor, and he leaves for Istanbul. The community, the mosque is sold off by his son Bilal Quilliam, and the community ceases to function, and it remains largely forgotten except by a few. I mean, I'm talking about outside the family. So this community was forgotten. A few some of the converts kept memory of Quilliam's community right up until you know, into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and where we began to hear word of this community. But that was really, we knew nothing about them. Local Muslims in Liverpool rediscovered this community by finding records in the local library in Liverpool. But interest in him has really picked up in the last 20 years in this community, academic interest and community interest. And the interest in Fatima and the other women converts has been, you know, it's broadened out from looking at Abdullah Quilliam, and now we're trying to understand the whole community of working class converts and what walks of life they came from, and so on, and you know, trying to contact families, descendants, try to find out individual histories. So Fatima is one of those, and her grave, unmarked grave, was identified in 2019. And last Ramadan, during there was a crowdfunding done, and money was raised within 24 hours for a new headstone, which was installed in November last year. And alhamdulillah, we had a commemoration of Fatima. We had 13 convert associations come from around the country to commemorate Fatima's memory in January this year. And that was a very historic event. And it brought together many converts, new and old, in Britain today from different backgrounds. And it was very much felt very much generative of a sense of community to honor one of our mothers, one of our pioneers, who came ahead of all of us and sort of paved the way. I'd like to thank my colleagues who helped me with all this research: Miriam Makdasulu, Rioda McNamara, Ron Jeeves, and Hamid Mahmoud. And these are some of the works which I've been involved in recent years in this area. They're all available, should be available, orderable through Amazon if you're interested in any of them. The one on the left is a kind of Ottoman travelogue, which we translated from Ottoman Turkish by a journalist who came from Cairo to Liverpool in 1895, and it's a very, very entertaining, very interesting read. The one in the middle is Abdullah Quilliam's collected poems, going over 4 decades of output, including the 25 years after he left Liverpool. And then also on the right is Fatima, who has obviously been a short biography of her, who's obviously been the focus of my talk today. So I think that wraps it up. I think I'm open for any questions that you might have, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yahya. It's so interesting. Actually, you shared with us such a lot of rich information about which we did not know. You took me back to my younger days in Tanzania, being a child of the colony. You know, we read in our geography classes about the discovery of new lands, how the British and Europeans came in search of the new land or the new world. But today you turn the journey, turn it around, that you took me from the new lands to the United Kingdom and to Europe and to America, where all this was happening. And still, people who live in the UK, as far as I know, they don't know about the history of the British Muslims. So here is something what we call as what Bernard Ruiz would call like Islam's discovery of Europe, but here is discovery of Islam in Britain. So so very brilliant and very informative information and discovery and the hard work you are involved in. So I'll open it up. If anybody has any questions, they can either raise their hands and then or ask the question directly. So if there's anyone who wants to ask a question or a query or make a comment, please go ahead. Sumaya, yeah, please go ahead, Sumaya. You can, Brother Muzammil, can you unmute Sumaya? Yeah,
Assalamualaikum.
Good evening
to all.
Sumaya is from Turkey.
Yeah. Dear Prof, dear Prof, I'd like to thank all of your.
Who?
You need to unmute her. Okay, go ahead, Sister
Sorry,
Sumaya.
sorry for the inconvenience. I'd like to ask about compare about other countries, other Europe countries. If we consider 18th century, there were other Ottoman students, for example, in Germany, and that country was those period an allied country of Ottoman Empire. But if we consider other students and their effectiveness, Great Britain students were those and till today it's so effective. Muslim society were so they was so effective in England and all those part of Great Britain. What is the effect main role, or what is the main position in this case? How you consider this other countries and Great Britain's position if you consider Muslim society and their role in a Christian country? Why they were so effective than other countries? For example, in William First, they were very close those period in Ottoman Empire. But if we consider Germany, there was no as much as effective and active role in as in Great Britain. What is the main role in this position, in this case? How do you consider this? Thank you so much for the answer in advance. I think it.
I think I understand your question. I think that the difference is not as big as you imagine. So if you in fact, there were Indian Muslim missionary movements that also targeted Germany that were allied to the mission in Woking.
Yeah.
So there was a similar mission in Berlin.
Yeah.
You would call this a kind of, I would say, a kind of Islamic modernism. Yeah. A kind of apologetical language of dawah that became very familiar to us in the 20th century was really pioneered in this period by these missionary movements in alliance with converts, both in Germany and in Britain, and really with the Indian Muslims. The Indian Muslims were the drivers of this. There was obviously some element of Ottoman patronage here, as well as other courts like the Afghans. But the engine of it really came from the alliance between the Indian Muslims and the converts, I would say. And with the kind of symbolic backing or favor of the Ottomans. Yeah, that's basically the relationship. And so they kind of developed an argument. And the reason why I think that what was seen to be the change in emphasis in Abdul-Quilliam's call is quite interesting, because beyond the kind of critique of Trinitarianism in Christianity and so on, he made a case for Islam as being superior civilization. And you remember, this is at the height of European imperialism, where the argument was that European civilization was superior. And he kind of reverses that argument. And this is what catches the attention of the ulama in various parts of the Muslim world, this argument that Quilliam makes for the superiority of Islamic civilization. So it captures the attention of people like Rashid Rida in Egypt, who reviews his work and appreciates it, of ulama in and it's translated into Turkish and Urdu and Bosniak and Farsi, mostly by ulama, or reformist-minded ulama, I would say, of the time. And so they found this argument very appealing. And so I'd say it was kind of, they worked to develop the sorts of arguments that became very common in the 20th century, became widely dispersed, let's say in English and other Islamicate languages. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you.
There are some written questions as well.
Yeah. Would you let me read them for you and you answer them?
Okay.
Yeah, so the first question is from Asif, is our student here. He says that the children of the converts in the UK did not remain in faith, while those who moved to Muslim majority lands remain in faith. What would be the reason for this?
I mean, I'm speculating here because I don't know the precise details of these families yet. It's extremely difficult to trace these families, but one can imagine that it's about having support and knowledge, accessibility to knowledge. So, you know, if you have an extended Muslim family around you who are steeped in those traditions and have that knowledge and learning and culture, then obviously that's going to be an influence upon you. But if you're isolated and there are no other Muslims around you and no one to turn to, then you may just fall out of practice and knowledge. If you see what I mean? The pressures are there for you to conform with the society. So I think this is not such a big mystery. I think the other thing is, as I said to you at the beginning, this was a community that was sort of on a journey from non-conformist Christianity to Islam. So, and they taught themselves. So I think that, you know, maybe we can say that it was a transitional movement, you know, and they were, you know, it would have taken, if the community had continued, it would have continued that journey and could have brought more people along with them. Rather like we see with the African Americans, we see a kind of element of transitional movements before most African American join Orthodox Islam. There are transitional movements, and so I think this is similar to that. And so the fact that people would remain or stay is maybe not so surprising when we take a historical perspective.
Yeah, well, your comment reminds me of Professor Ali Mazrui giving a talk at University of Pennsylvania, where he said, for the African Americans, the way to Africa is through Islam. It just came up in my mind, and what you said is a journey, and a journey which begins and goes through different phases. Dr. Nasreen is asking a question. Why did they adopt the Hanafi fiqh? Was it because of the Ottoman influence?
I think it was twofold influence. It was the Ottomans and it was the Indians, because both of them, majority followed the Hanafi school of law. Some of the imams who were appointed to the community came from India. One of them, in fact, was very, very famous, Maulana Barakatullah Bhopali, who was the imam in Liverpool between 1893 and 1896. I mean, he became a very famous pan-Islamist activist and anti-imperialist campaigner. So he was the first president of the Azadi Free Government of India in Exile, which was established in Kabul, I think, during the First World War, or just shortly thereafter. So a very famous person. In fact, there's a university named after him in India, as far as I'm aware.
Sister Ifat is asking that, did Fatima learn to read the Quran? If so, yeah.
I mean, I don't know is the answer to that, but she would have had an opportunity because she was there in the years that the first Indian imam came. And so if he taught them how to read, she had access to somebody who could teach her, let's put it that way. Not in the first years, but maybe you know, let's say around about 1893 onwards, you would have had some opportunity to do so. So maybe she took it up. She was a very studious woman, and certainly read the translation very carefully and studied it.
Brother said Iftikhar is asking the question that you said she built an educational institution. How did this benefit the Muslims?
Are you talking about Shah Jahan? For clarity.
Iftikhar, are you talking about Shah Jahan or Fatima? Let me unmute you.
Yes, yes, dear Prof. Shah Jahan.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, she was, as you probably know, she was a great patron of art and architecture during her reign. She was also wrote her own poetry in Urdu and Farsi. She must have been persuaded of the benefits of supporting Leitner's Oriental College. The idea was of this Oriental College was that it was going to train up mostly British subjects from India, and it was going to be, you know, like a major, it's going to be a major institution. It didn't survive Leitner's death, but he was going to make it multi-religious. So there was going to be a mosque, a mandir, and a gurdwara on the same campus site, but he only ever built the mosque, which is what the only thing that survives. Even the college itself has gone, but the mosque has remained. I mean, I guess that she just felt that it was an investment in an educational institute and in establishing Islam in the imperial metropole. You know, when the British were promoting Christianity and building churches all over India, maybe she felt she could build a mosque in England. You know, I mean, it's not that surprising, is it, that
Yeah.
she might want to patronize something of that kind.
Dr. Nasreen is asking another question.
Yeah.
The Liverpool Muslim Institute, did it get any coverage in the newspapers, positive or negative?
It got it got a lot of attention from the local Liverpool press, but not so much from the London Times or some of these other bigger newspapers, although occasionally there would be something. But it's not true in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, this community was a hot story, and the news got everywhere. And it got to the stage where in Cairo, Istanbul, Delhi, Bombay, you could read the weekly news about this community, who had visited, comings and goings, what was going on, what was the lecture that week. So the kind of weekly doings of this community were regularly reported. We have a witness, a very strong witness for this, in the testimony of Yusuf Sami Asmai, whose travelogue to England, to the mosque in 1895, we translated from Ottoman Turkish. And in the first chapter of his travelogue, he sort of says, 8 years ago, a sound was heard far out from the west, and the sound said, Islam has arrived in England. And the sound grew and it grew, and then we kept hearing more and more details about this community of converts and so on, and everybody was talking about it in Cairo and speculating, was this really true? Was this some kind of imperial propaganda from the British, or were these genuine converts? You know, there was sort of debate in Cairo about this. So in other words, this was a hot news story of the day, and Quilliam's Faith of Islam, his first major pamphlet on Islam, I mean, it was translated into several languages, and was widely distributed, mostly translated by members of the reformist ulama, as far as I can tell. So you know, yeah, it was widely reported on.
Okay. The next question is from Sister Ishrat, Bibi Ishrat, who's a PhD student here. She says that you said that egalitarian ethos attracted feminist female conversions to Islam. do you think the representation of Islam currently as a patriarchal religion in the media discourages female conversion to Islam?
I would say that I would go one step further. I would say that a patriarchal presentation of Islam discourages Muslim women already in the faith, let alone Muslim women looking to join the faith of Islam.
Another question is from Professor Noor Manaf. Could you comment on the role of Liverpool as a huge port, which could have been a port of entry of Islam? Muslim African slaves were brought to America via the port, and was not this time when Queen Victoria had a Muslim butler, so Muslim could not be that alien to England. And there was a movie about that recently.
Okay, yeah, so Munshi Abdul Karim was Queen Victoria's personal servant and became her Hindustani teacher, as Urdu was then known as Hindustani. But no, we shouldn't overstate that. I mean, there were only a small number of Muslims in England at the time. So, and as I was said to you earlier, they were coming in and out, often for study or as sailors, or, and as part of the imperial system, if you like. And as I said, settled communities were only just beginning to emerge and to start in some kind of organized form. So I don't think it was likely that people would have met Muslims on a day-to-day basis. I mean, not like today. In Britain today, there are 4 million Muslims nearly, and it's in the fabric of this country's life now. Probably people see Muslims every day on the street in most towns and cities across the country, but that wasn't the case then. As for Liverpool as a port, yeah, this is right. Liverpool was the second port of the British Empire, if you like, after London. Something like half of Britain's shipping went through its docks, and about a seventh of world trade went through its docks. And it was also the major passenger port for people traveling from the East and also from America. They would come through Liverpool. So this means that, for instance, that many Muslim dignitaries, senior Ottoman officials, the Crown Prince of Afghanistan, who visited the mosque in 1895, the Shah of Persia, and other dignitaries passed through Liverpool. And as word spread of the existence of an English mosque, if you like, where they sang hymns, people wanted to visit. And so, we have accounts in Arabic and in Urdu and other languages of people visiting the mosque and, reporting back what they saw and so on. So word got around and they were regularly visited.
I have a question. You used two words, modernism and reformism. Can you say something more on that?
I think that I appreciate that these are loaded terms in a Muslim context. I'm trying not to make too big a normative claim about this, merely using them more in a descriptive sense. But let me put it like this. I think at this time, there was an acceptance that the material achievements of the Western colonizing powers could be adopted profitably and easily by Muslims, so long as they retained their core Islamic values. So there was a kind of confidence about that. And that confidence, maybe today we're more wary when we look back now, because we see some of the complexities of that, or some of the costs, if you like, as well as the benefits of adopting that. So I think we might, with the benefit of hindsight, consider it to be maybe a bit naive of them. But I think maybe that is not the job of an historian. The job of an historian is to try and understand why people acted the way that they did, given what they knew at the time and what choices were available to them at the time. I mean, there's nothing worse than the condescension of posterity, looking back with our experience and hindsight and imposing that onto the choices of people of the past. So I don't think we should ever do that. I think we should look at history, warts and all, but with the eye of charity, you know, where we can apply it. And so this has always been my approach to studying these early convert communities.
I found it interesting. You're talking about singing of hymns and the organ in the and the use of Mohammedan Bible and the church, Mohammedan church. This tells a lot about that epoch of history when Islam was just entering. And people get upset, you know, today when people say, "Oh, the word Mohammedan should not be used." But as you said, we are at the hindsight. But at that time, people did not even know who Muhammad was. So they attributed that term, whoever attributed or used that term did not understand that monotheism of Islam was different from that of other religions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's just part of, for me, what's very interesting is that I think that our communities are very, very open to understanding this history. I think they're very willing to step back into the past. And I think we're very willing to understand that things were maybe different back then. I think that's okay. I think you know, it's sort of like people say that travel broadens the mind. I think you can also time travel, and you can travel back in time and try to understand what it was like to live in a different time and place. And I think that's good for our imaginations. It tells us that, you know, maybe we are suffering difficulties today, but other people suffered difficulties too. We're not alone in those experiences. I think for speaking personally as a convert to Islam myself, you know, I've always found it fascinating to have discovered for myself these communities, early communities, because first of all, it's happening a lot longer ago than I thought it was. When I first converted, I had no idea about these communities. I didn't realize it went back so far. I know I'm saying so far, this is for Britain. Obviously, I'm talking to people who have hundreds, maybe over 1,000 years of Islam in their country's history. But for us, 140 years is a long time as newcomers to the Ummah. But the thing is that nonetheless, it's still important to us to discover this history. And the second thing that really fascinated me was that how did they match their culture with their faith identity? So how did they try to merge the two and so on? And what was very interesting for me is that they did it with they didn't have a huge amount of knowledge, but what they did have was a huge amount of confidence to just give it a go, try their best from the little that they knew and give it a go. And they did a lot with a little. And so I find that really inspiring when we have so much and we just complain all the time. Actually, you know, it's quite salutary. It's quite a lesson to see these people had very little and did so much. So it's a kind of a chastener for us today to up our game and to do have more confidence in trying to have a cultural synthesis between our culture and our faith as British Muslims. And I don't want to suggest for a moment that only converts are shaping what it means to be British Muslim. We're just part of that multicultural conversation that we have today with 4 million Muslims, and converts are only maybe 150,000 of that 4 million or something like that. But, you know, obviously we're part of that conversation too.
Yeah, I liked hearing about the self-confession, you know, the Shahada, which they said, but which 3 people said it on their own. This is something very, very unique in Islamic history, where 3 people come up and say, we take up the Shahada, pledging to the Shahada. Very interesting historical historical and ritual, which I've never heard about before. There's one more question. Issue of identity is always important with new convert communities. Oh, he's just making a comment. So
if I can come on to the point that you made, Professor Imtiaz, which is that you might be interested to know that when Rafiuddin Ahmed, he came up, the Indian lawyer who came to help them and traveled up to Liverpool and probably around about 1889, 1890 and became vice president. The first thing he did when he got there, he said, insisted they all sit down and recite the Shahada after him. although they had been trying to practice Islam for, a couple of years before that, he still wanted them to sit down and take the Shahada. But I think that, we all admit the possibility of an Uwaisi idea of Islam. If somebody realizes the truth of Islam, even if they're on their own, we wouldn't just say the declaration in front of another Muslim would be the condition for them to have become Muslim. And so they witnessed themselves becoming Muslim. And I guess it's also, a tribute to the age of print, so books are so widely available, the translations were available, people could study on their own. And let's be honest, many people still come to Islam through this route of self-study without talking to any other Muslim. And we know this, it's not always about contact. So it still happens today, I believe. I believe somebody may have declared themselves a Muslim without having taken a Shahada. I'm sure that is a possibility, at least chronologically.
For using the Hindustani language for Rafiuddin Ahmed, maybe their iman was not that pakka, not that ripe enough that they had to sit down and take the Shahada again. When you made this comment, I remember meeting Professor Massimo Campanini, who passed away recently. He's written on Islamic philosophy and Quran. I met him in Morocco, in Casablanca, and I asked him what religion you follow, and he said, I'm a Hanif. So what could I say more, because what is going on between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not my business. So so this is very interesting that in the West there are people who are Muslims that through self-study and they come to Islam on their own, and Allah knows the best, as we say, Allahu Alam all the time. I'd like to see Professor Bargut. Are you here? Dr. Nasreen, okay, you can ask a question yourself. I'll unmute you. Brother Muzammil, can you unmute Dr. Nasreen? Brother Muzammil. I need it.
Hello, sir.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Now, I was not making a comment. I was just agreeing with what you're saying. That's what it comes
okay.
But it's been a very, very good discussion with Dr. Yahya Birt as well. It's interesting that those issues that you raise up is actually quite interesting. And seeing that, I don't know why, but in the UK with all the vast libraries that are there, it makes it easier for people to conduct their own study if they require in regards to studying about the faith and about Islam. It really helps. Anyway, thank you very much.
No problem.
Yeah, Professor Bargut, I don't see him here. Just commenting further on to Dr. Nasreen, the name of Dr. Yahya Birt, that I is misplaced somewhere, either first in between. It should be before R or after R. When I when I saw Dr. Yahya's work, I thought it was Yahya Birt, Yahya British, but it is something else. So that's the interesting part of your last name. So thank you, Dr. Yahya. Thank you very much. We really learned a lot tonight. Your afternoon, you're there, and it tells us a lot about how. There's a question here, I think. Then let's get to Sister Muzammila. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. I want to thank, oh, she wants to thank to us. Okay, that was a comment. So, Dr. Yahya, thank you very much for this very interesting information about the discovery of British Islam and 140 years and such a rich history. More research can be done and learned, especially by the native British, by the British Muslims who are there, the younger generation. And you see it's happening also in the United States and other parts of Europe. So Jazakumullah khair, and we'll hope to see you again sometime. Yes, anyone? Yes,
Yeah,
yes, brother.
I just want to ask Dr. Yahya a question. If that's okay. I know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for this presentation. It's certainly a interesting and an eye-opening one. I have two short questions. Firstly, with all this rich history within the UK context, right? Are there any progress being made either from a Muslim institution or others that are aiming to teach that particular part of British history to a mainstream? I know there's publication and other platform, but in terms of like teaching at school and university, is there are there some work being done in this regard? And the other one is, can the Muslim now consider themselves a kind of initial, the initial part of British? So in other words, not being called foreigners anymore. Can the Muslim now then say, look, we're just part of it from early age? Is this, can we make that claim now instead of just saying, we migrated and so on, since we have such a large amount of history within the British?
Well, what do you think? I mean, is it something that you have to ask permission for, or is it something that you feel anyway?
No, I don't think you have to have permission, but it's very important for it to be out.
So just, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I think it's very interesting when people ask this question as if they need a confirmation. So why do you feel you need the confirmation? If you already feel British already, what is driving you to ask for confirmation of that from history or from
it's changing the language of the textbook. It's not so much for me or the individual, it's actually changing it. So instead of saying they migrated then and Islam was introduced then, you change the whole kind of the language to say, well, it wasn't introduced as such, it was from early age. So that I know what you're saying, and it does sound like I need some sort of confirmation. It's not, I just so that it's no longer alien, but unfortunately still Islam is looked at.
I mean, I think Islam is indigenous and it's universal, right? So it's never fully indigenized either, because it stands for a universal principle. So although Islam is as a universal call can be part of any human culture on the planet, this is what we believe. So all human cultures, languages, they all come together in a universal call of Islam. But at the same time, its universality has another inflection, which is that actually those universal principles through which will be expressed differently through each culture will also be like a testing ground or a metal, if you like. So it's always going to never be fully acculturated. It's always going to be a filter for culture at the same time as a universal call. So, it's not only that Islam changes to meet cultural patterns, but also Islam changes those cultures. So it's both. So I think that I think there's always going to be a question that Islam will always be above any kind of narrow religious nationalism, let alone a secular nationalism. Yeah. So I mean, it's always going to be an ethical challenge to that being a member of any tribe or culture, right or wrong. Is, you know, as a Muslim, you're always going to be questioning a kind of narrow loyalty that's not bound by a universal set of Islamic ethics, you know. So I think that tension is a productive, important, and a prophetic tension that we must live with, not try to resolve it. We have to journey with that. I think that it's very important that we tell other stories other than the official story of British history. So we tell, but I'm not confident that the school system such as it exists will be sufficiently receptive to all of the alternate histories that we offer. So we should always put resources into teaching that to our children in our own community spaces and to adults as well. Because I don't think the schooling system will meet all of our requirements as a community. To shape our sense of self and our identity and to invest in that, we need to invest resources and not rely on the state educational system to deliver that to us. You know, increasingly history in the British school system is seen as a kind of a ideological tool for kind of national identity and conformity. And so I still think we have to have our own narrative history in order to generate our own sense of identity and belonging amongst our Muslim children. So they know that they're part of the history of Britain, but also they're part of a wider ummah with a universal call. And that's on us to do. I don't think we should be, yes, we should be getting it out into the mainstream, but I think in terms of educating future generations, we have to still take that inside our community institutions for it to be delivered fully and meaningfully.
Yeah, narrative studies is so important. And narratology is so current these days. Even that without narrative studies, we won't know. I'm also saying here what Sister Muzammila is talking about, that there may be even other narratives about found in Urdu or Hindi language of Muslim women who converted to Islam, and they need to be found. There's more research to be done. We are going a little bit over time. So now I call upon our Dean, Professor Abdulaziz Barkut, to say the final word and to thank Professor Yahya. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. First of all, let me thank Prof. Yahya for this wonderful lecture. I think we should have more and more very research-based kind of narratives. I think that's really great. We have learned a lot of things today. I would like also to thank Prof. MTS for the choice, the topic, the scholar. I think this is something great. Please continue, and I thank all the participants here. I think it's a great session today. May God bless you all.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the participants who have joined us this evening, and hope to see you again. By the way, just a reminder, this Thursday, we have another event, a similar lecture with Dr. Hamidullah Marazi. So thank you, everyone. And Dr. Yahya, thank you very much. And inshallah, we'll call upon you again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.